Chapter 1 of Fanny Herself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. Chapter 1. You could not have lived a week in Winnebago without being aware of Mrs. Brandeis. In a town of 10,000, where everyone was a personality, from Hen Cody the drayman in blue overalls, magically transformed on Sunday mornings into a suave black broadcloth usher at the Congregational Church, to A. J. Dawes, who owned the waterworks before the city bought it. Mrs. Brandeis was a super personality. Winnebago did not know it. Winnebago, buying its dolls and china and Battenberg braid and tinware and toys of Mrs. Brandeis, of Brandeis's Bazaar, realized vaguely that here was someone different. When you entered the long, cool, narrow store on Elm Street, Mrs. Brandeis herself came forward to serve you, unless she was already busy with 2 customers. There were 2 clerks, 3 if you count Aloysius, the boy. But to Mrs. Brandeis belonged the privilege of docketing you first. If you happened in during a moment of business lull, you were likely to find her reading in the left-hand corner at the front of the store. Near the shelf were ranged the dolls' heads, the pens, the pencils, and school supplies. You saw a sturdy, well-set-up, alert woman, of the kind that looks taller than she really is. A woman with a long, straight, clever nose that indexed her character, as did everything about her, from her crisp, vigorous, abundant hair to the way she came down hard on her heels in walking. She was what might be called a very definite person. But first you remarked her eyes. Will you concede that eyes can be piercing, yet velvety? Their piercingness was a mental quality, I suppose, and the velvety softness a physical one. One could only think, somehow, of wild pansies, the brown kind. If Winnebago had taken the trouble to glance at the title of the book she laid face down on the pencil boxes as you entered, it would have learned that the book was one of Balzac's, or perhaps Zangwill's, or Zola's. She never could overcome that habit of snatching a chapter here and there during dull moments. She was too tired to read when night came. There were many times when the little Wisconsin town lay broiling in the August sun, or locked in the January drifts, and the main business street was as silent as that of a deserted village. But more often she came forward to you from the rear of the store, with bits of excelsior clinging to her black sateen apron. You knew that she had been helping Aloysius as he unpacked a consignment of chamber sets, or a hogshead of china or glassware, chalking each piece with the price mark as it was dug from its nest of straw and paper. "How do you do?" she would say. "What can I do for you?" And in that moment she had you listed, indexed and filed, were you a farmer woman in a black shawl and rusty bonnet, with a faded rose bobbing grotesquely atop it, or one of the patronizing East End set who came to Brandeis's Bazaar because Mrs. Brandeis's party favors, for one thing, were of a variety that could be got nowhere else this side of Chicago. If, after greeting you, Mrs. Brandeis called, "Sadie, stockings," supposing stockings were your quest, you might know that Mrs. Brandeis had weighed you and found you wanting. There had always been a store, at least ever since Fanny could remember. She often thought how queer it would seem to have to buy pins or needles, or dishes or soap or thread. The store held all these things, and many more. Just to glance at the bewildering display outside gave you promise of the variety within. Winnebago was rather ashamed of that display. It was before the day of repression in decoration, and the 2 benches in front of the windows overflowed with lamps and water sets, and brooms and boilers and tinware and hampers. Once the Winnebago Courier had had a sarcastic editorial about what they called the Oriental Bazaar. That was after the editor, Lem Davis, had bumped his shin against a toy cart that protruded unduly. But Mrs. Brandeis changed nothing. She knew that the farmer women who stood outside with their husbands on busy Saturdays would not have understood repression in display. But they did understand the tickets that marked the wares in plain figures. This berry set, $1.59. That lamp, $1.23. They talked it over outside, and drifted away, and came back, and entered, and bought. She knew when to be old-fashioned, did Mrs. Brandeis, and when to be modern. She had worn the first short walking skirt in Winnebago. It cleared the ground in a day before germs were discovered, when women's skirts trailed and flounced behind them in a cloud of dust. One of her scandalized neighbors, Mrs. Nathan Perilous it was, had taken her aside to tell her that no decent woman would dress that way. "Next year," said Mrs. Brandeis, "when you are wearing one, I'll remind you of that." And she did, too. She had worn shirtwaists with a broad Gibson shoulder tuck when other Winnebago women were still encased in linings and bodices. Do not get the impression that she stood for emancipation or feminism or any of those advanced things. They had scarcely been touched on in those days. She was just an extraordinarily alert woman, mentally and physically, with a shrewd sense of values. Molly Brandeis never could set a table without forgetting the spoons or the salt or something, but she could add a double column of figures in her head as fast as her eye could travel. There she goes, running off with the story, as we were afraid she would. Not only that, she is using up whole pages of description when she should be giving us dialogue. Prospective readers running their eyes over a printed page object to the solid block formation of the descriptive passage. And yet it is fascinating to weave words about her, as it is fascinating to turn a fine diamond this way and that in the sunlight to catch its prismatic hues. Besides, you want to know, do you not, how this woman who reads Balzac should be waiting upon you in a little general store in Winnebago, Wisconsin? In the first place, Ferdinand Brandeis had been a dreamer and a potential poet, which is bad equipment for success in the business of general merchandise. 4 times since her marriage, Molly Brandeis has packed her household goods, bade her friends good-bye, and with her 2 children, Fanny and Theodore, had followed her husband to pastures new. A heartbreaking business that, but broadening. She knew nothing of the art of buying and selling at the time of her marriage, but as the years went by she learned unconsciously the things one should not do in business, from watching Ferdinand Brandeis do them all. She even suggested this change and that, but to no avail. Ferdinand Brandeis was a gentle and lovable man at home, a testy, quick-tempered one in business. That was because he had been miscast from the first, and yet had played one part too long, even though unsuccessfully, ever to learn another. He did not make friends with the genial traveling salesman who breezed in, slapped him on the back, offered him a cigar, inquired after his health, opened their sample cases, and flirted with the girl clerks, all in a breath. He was a man who talked little, listened little, learned little. He had never got the trick of turning his money over quickly, that trick so necessary to the success of the small-town business. So it was that, in the year preceding Ferdinand Brandeis's death, there came often to the store a certain grim visitor. Herman Walthers, cashier of the First National Bank of Winnebago, was a kindly enough, shrewd, small-town banker. But to Ferdinand Brandeis and his wife his visits, growing more and more frequent, typified all that was frightful, presaged misery and despair. He would drop in on a bright summer morning, perhaps, with a cheerful greeting. He would stand for a moment at the front of the store, balancing airily from toe to heel, and glancing about from shelf to bin and back again in a large, speculative way. Then he would begin to walk slowly and ruminatively about, his shrewd little German eyes appraising the stock. He would hum a little absent-minded tune as he walked, up one aisle and down the next. There were only 2. Picking up a piece of china there, turning it over to look at its stamp, holding it up to the light, tapping it a bit with his knuckles, and putting it down carefully before going musically on down the aisle to the water sets, the lamps, the stockings, the hardware, the toys. And so, his hands behind his back, still humming, out the swinging screen door and into the sunshine of Elm Street, leaving gloom and fear behind him. 1 year after Molly Brandeis took hold, Herman Walthers' visits ceased, and in 2 years he used to rise to greet her from his little cubbyhole when she came into the bank. Which brings us to the plush photograph album. The plush photograph album is a concrete example of what makes business failure and success. More than that, its brief history presents a complete characterization of Ferdinand and Molly Brandeis. 10 years before, Ferdinand Brandeis had bought a large bill of Christmas fancy goods, celluloid toilette sets, leather collar boxes, velvet glove cases. Among the lot was a photograph album in the shape of a huge acorn done in lightning-struck plush. It was a hideous thing, and expensive. It stood on a brass stand, and its leaves were edged in gilt, and its color was a nauseous green and blue, and it was altogether the sort of thing to grace the chill and funereal best room in a Wisconsin farmhouse. Ferdinand Brandeis marked it at $6, and stood it up for the Christmas trade. That had been 10 years before. It was too expensive, or too pretentious, or perhaps even too horrible for the bucolic purse. At any rate, it had been taken out, brushed, dusted, and placed on its stand every holiday season for 10 years. On the day after Christmas,